As mentioned, I'm Josh Turiel. I run and have run for 19 years a small consultancy with myself and a couple other guys. We do mainly Mac, and we do a decent amount of Windows support as well. One of my three employees specializes in Windows work. The other one specializes in Mac, and I do both and move back and forth between the spheres, and also do some of the rocket science stuff behind the scenes for it all. So, it's primarily small to mid-sized business IT. We do some residential. We do a lot of, just sort of whatever will pay the bills in a given week. And so far it hasn't failed catastrophically, so I'm encouraged. My own personal proclivity is towards Apple product for the most part. I've supported a lot of Apple product through the years. I've worked corporate IT jobs supporting Apple products. And so I've been through many, many cycles and generations of processor and operating system change from Apple. And so just to kind of go into it, I only have a total of one slide, and it's not even a slide. It's just a little explainer that's on a sheet that I wrote, and I will put that up at some point during it. But first, I want to kind of go into sort of the conventions of Apple and how they do things like product number, operating system numbering, product generations, because a lot of that it's very intuitive to people like me who've been working in the Apple world for a long time. But to people who primarily live in the world of Windows, it can be pretty confusing because we're used to Windows releases every 4 or 5 years. We're used to service packs, or now they have like spring and fall releases. So we're used to Patch Tuesday, things like that, and we're used to being tied to one particular vendor's product cycles, typically Intel. So Apple has had some independence over the years. So first of all, when Macintosh at this point is not quite 40 years old. It's 40 years old next spring. So when the platform released, it was a single tasking system based on floppy drives that ran on a Motorola 68,000 processor. Over the ensuing roughly, just doing a little math in my head, over the ensuing roughly 8 or 9 years, it ran on, hang on 1 second. So I just had to get a message to my son, otherwise who is at his internship right now. And if I didn't respond that I can't talk, he would be pounding me with successive text messages and phone calls until finally I gave in. So if I just tell him I'm not available, he accepts that usually. So anyhow, about 8 years into into the Macintosh's transition, they migrated processor architectures in the hopes of improving performance and returns on it. And they went to a architecture called PowerPC that had been co-developed by Motorola and IBM based on the Power architecture that was being used in IBM's fairly advanced Unix workstations. That was the first major change for Apple in architectures. They went from the 68,000 architecture to the PowerPC architecture and continued to run, albeit modified, a version of the same operating system that they had been previously using, which was just simply called Mac OS. That status quo continued for the next several years and through Apple's near-death experiences that many of us read about at the time, because I think we're all old enough to remember those days. And then one of the things that had been holding Apple back at that point was that they had a very crude older architecture for their operating system that couldn't adapt to modern technology particularly well. So they started developing from scratch a new operating system to replace the classic Mac OS. The effort failed, and they wound up with Plan B, which was to buy Steve Jobs' company, take his operating system, bolt some stuff onto it, and turn that into the new next generation Mac operating system. That effort worked out as well. When that was released, it was in approximately 2001. That was released as Mac OS 10 with an X after it instead, but pronounced as Mac OS 10. Mac OS 10 was the first real step. It had retained a compatibility box that could run older PowerPC apps that were written for the classic architecture for some time. They continued supporting that architecture for a number of years, so they kept backwards compatibility fairly well. Then, in approximately 2004, frustrated by the inability of IBM and Motorola to prioritize making faster PowerPC processors, Apple then flipped to the world what they called a pretty well kept secret, although everybody knew they were doing it because reasons, and they converted at that point from using the PowerPC architecture to using Intel architecture. So they started releasing Intel processor-based computers that year. Over the course of roughly a year, they transitioned the whole product line over to Intel. The Mac OS had been secretly being written for Intel as well as PowerPC all along, because the next operating system they purchased from Steve Jobs was in fact an Intel and PowerPC operating system, so they just kept on doing it. And that set the pace for the next roughly 15 years, where the only difference hardware-wise is Apple's engineering standards were a little higher, manufacturing standards were a little higher. So the machines were fairly well engineered compared to your typical bargain basement PC laptop or desktop. And you didn't have those ugly Intel inside stickers on them. Other than that, the hardware was all essentially identical to what a PC vendor would sell you from, for run Windows on. So in the meantime, and this is the most confusing thing about what Apple did until recently, is Mac OS X or 10 every year got a new update, and Apple does their updates. They don't do, well, I'll come back to this, but so Apple released Mac OS 10.1, 10.2, 10.3. Each was a periodic every year to 18 months or so. They did a new release and just incremented there, and any updates within that time were incremented by another digit on the end. So like Mac OS 10.4.2 would be the current, I think 10.4.4, I think, for instance, was the first one to run on Intel. Just as an example, and they continued along on that naming scheme until they finally realized a few years ago that they were just running out of 10-point numbers to use. So they finally killed that branding with Big Sur, which we just I heard mentioned in the earlier discussion. And subsequent operating systems have been numbered Mac OS 11, Mac OS 12, Mac OS 13, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, for instance, the current operating system, Mac OS Ventura, which they use, all their names are given. For the first roughly dozen years of Mac OS 10, they were using cat-based names for their operating system. There was Cheetah and Panther and Lion and Mountain Lion and a Tiger and all these others. And then they realized they were also running out of felines to use. There we go. So they were running out of felines, and a few years ago they switched to start using. I'm seeing the presentation, this thing in front of me, but which is slightly distracting, so I apologize. So they are now naming operating systems after locations in California. So the current version is Mac OS, to get up to today, is Mac OS 13 Ventura. So as you see, Mac OS 12 was called Monterey. Ventura is the current version, and it's now on an annual release model. So Apple's release cycle is pretty linked up pretty closely to, and you see Mac OS 10.16, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, all right. So anyway, so we've been doing them for a while. There was Catalina, Big Sur, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So also in just getting familiar with how Apple does things. So now for the last roughly 8 years or so, Apple has been on a pretty tight annual release model for their main operating systems for all their various platforms. At the beginning of June, they announced the new operating systems at their Worldwide Developers Conference, which is colloquially referred to as DubDub. They announce what the new operating system is. They preview a lot of the features to developers. They make it available to developers to download as they iterate towards release. And then the operating systems are traditionally released in the mid to late September timeframe. Sometimes one version, usually the Mac version, if that's the case, will lag by a few weeks and slip into early October. And it's tied to product release cycles because, as everybody knows, the middle of September is also new iPhone day. So when they release a new version, they release the new iPhone, the new operating system ships on the new iPhones and is available for download a day or so before the iPhones start arriving in people's hot little hands, and everything is synchronized accordingly. So I'll take the question that Larry has. I see there, he has a hand up. I'll take his question, and then we'll kind of get into the other side of the cycle. Go ahead.
You ready for my question?
Yeah.
I guess if they designate, operating system 10, 11, why do they need a designation after that? Like Leopard or Ventura?
The actual release is the name. So that's just Apple's convention, is the same way there was a Windows Vista where they tried not to use any number for it. Apple has been using, well, initially, I'll backtrack. Initially, when Apple started with OS X, they didn't have numbers. They had code names for it in development. So Mac OS X itself was called Puma when it was being developed in the in the labs at Apple and before it was publicly released. But code names had a habit of leaking out. And so eventually Apple just decided to embrace it and use those what were originally code names as the actual name of the operating system. And that was something of a differentiation move too on their part. It's much friendlier to say Mac OS Tiger than it is to say Mac OS 10.4. So what they did, of course, was use both. So each annual release has a name. It corresponds to a version number. And then during the course of that year, there will be major and minor updates to the operating system, security updates, and all the like. Just to give you an idea, right this moment, the current version of Ventura is 13.4.1C. And that as of today, and there's a 13.5 that just entered release candidate status a day ago and will probably start getting pushed out to people's machines next week. And the next version of Mac OS will be Mac OS 14. I can't even remember what the name of it is, but that's the pattern that they're using, and that will be released sometime in what is it?
Sonoma. That's
Sonoma. Yes, I'll remember that just in time for it to be replaced at next year's DubDub. So Sonoma will be Mac OS 10.14. Sonoma will be released sometime in the mid-September to early October timeframe, probably tied to the release of new Macs at that point in time.
I thought it would be homeless.
Womp womp. Well, that's not a place in California, remember. That's just the status of some people in California. They did joke one time when they first did things in the announcement when they said they were changing their naming scheme to places in California that inspired them. One of the things that they flashed up on the screen was Mac OS Weed. So they did not, however, go with it, sadly.
I think Death Valley.
So, and that might be at some point, who knows? But so at So in the meantime, Apple now had a consistent release schedule. They also had done a lot of engineering work to develop really high power processors based on the ARM architecture. And they've been using that for their mobile devices ever since the iPhone back in 2008. So they've been developing iPhones using it. They've been developing iPads using it. They started developing watches using it, and all sorts of other devices. The A-series architecture that they've been using has proven to be very, very flexible, very scalable. It can work in extremely small, low-power devices and extremely high-powered devices. So in a move that surprised almost nobody, in the middle of 2020, Apple announced that as of that year, they were going to start building their Macs based on said processors. So I'm going to put this on the screen. Let's see. And so I just have to move this over so I can see it. There, so in 2020, they announced that the first upcoming processor, and it was the M1 processor. The M1 processor was based on a earlier generation processor of an A-series processor, the A14 to be specific, which was the processor powering that was powering the iPhone 12 that came out that following year. Or late that year. So the M1 processor has became the basis of the first generation of Apple Silicon products. That processor family expanded to consist of a more capable M1 Pro, a M1 Max, and an M1 Ultra. The Ultra being two Max chips interconnected with one another. Generation 2 completed this spring with the release last spring of the M2 processor, followed by the M2 Pro and M2 Max processors, and finally the M2 Ultra processor. The base chip, as I mentioned here, is in the lowest end MacBook Pro, all MacBook Air models, and also the iPad Pro and iPad Air models. Those are now based on the desktop processors. Meanwhile, A-series processors, which are what the M is an expansion of, the current processor in that generation is the A16. It's what the M2 is based upon, and it is available in the iPhone Pro series. The previous generation, A15, is what's in the iPhone 14 and the iPhone 13 as well series that's still on the market, and so forth and so on down. So what we'll see this fall when they announce new iPhones will be an A17 processor. It'll have various improvements, be built on a smaller process. And as usual, you'll have all the other vendors complaining that nobody needs it and we'll have something just like it in 6 months. That seems to be pretty common. So let's see, let's turn off the share. So if you guys got that, we'll go back to the main thing. So now what you have in the Apple world is all the processors are being controlled and designed by Apple. The operating system is incremented annually, as is the processor family. And then Apple's product family itself consists essentially of three actual computing platforms at this point in time. One is the iPhone, 2 is the iPad, and 3 is the Macintosh. In the case of the Macintosh, you have the lines you have are the MacBook Air series, which right now consists of 3 models. It consists of one holdover previous generation of the MacBook Air from the original M1 redesign of it. So it looks like that classic thin wedge-shaped MacBook Air that you've seen on desks for the last 15 years or so. And then it has a newer design MacBook Air based on the M2 processor. Then there's the MacBook Pro, which has a low-end model that looks like an old traditional MacBook Pro, again, from the last dozen years or so. And that is based on that's been based on the M1, the low-end M1 and M2 processors. And then you have the 13, or you have the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, which had been built on the M2, are currently built on the M2 Pro or the M2 Max chips, which again are just improvements upon each other. I just saw a question pop up: who actually fabs the processors? The processors are all made by TMSC using their foundries, mostly in Taiwan. They're building a fab in Arizona right now that supposedly is going to take some of the load, but we'll see what goes where. And then their desktop computers consist of the Mac Mini, the iMac, the Mac Studio, and the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro, just a couple of months ago, was the last machine to be transitioned over to use Apple Silicon. At this point, there are no machines with Intel processors remaining to purchase. They had kept that on a Xeon until earlier this year. The Mac Studio was an all-new product that was built from scratch using Apple Silicon processors. The Mac Mini is a slim, very compact form factor desktop computer. The Mac Studio is in roughly the same form factor, but about 3 times taller, with more I/O ports, more powerful processors, and much heavier duty cooling. And the Mac Pro is a gigantic, heavyweight aluminum machine with that looks like a cheese grater. Kind of a tradition on their part. So, and then the iMac, I think everybody knows what an iMac looks like. It's about as iconic as a desktop gets. That is their low-end desktop. They no longer make a large screen version of the iMac. That was a thing for a number of years. The current iMac is the only all-in-one computer, and it's a 24-inch device. So that's the hardware line. That's the software. Apple's release cycles for hardware tend to be only 1 to 3 times a year. They will usually have a spring release of some devices. It could be independent in the April to sometime, generally the April to June timeframe. If they consider them significant enough, they announce them at their developers conference, which is their biggest, other than the iPhone launch, that's their biggest collection of eyeballs that they gather during the year. They will usually release hardware around the time of the iPhone introduction, and then they may do it again in a mid-cycle refresh in the January timeframe. They will do things like adding an additional color to the iPhones, potentially a minor refresh on other devices, and it all varies. The only other thing from a product cycle standpoint to consider right now is their entry. August is generally a bad time to buy an iPhone because there's always a new one coming in September. They're going to have their mixed reality device showing up sometime early next year. You're not going to want to purchase it, but you're going to be really interested in what the next one does in a couple of years. That's really, they're building a product for what is essentially a niche market, but it's an intriguing one. And then iPads tend to be refreshed once or twice a year as well on a similar cycle. They will usually introduce something using their newest processor in the fall, and generally there's some kind of updates done in the spring. So, Steve, you have
you said there's a new new something coming out, but you're not going to want to get it. I'm wondering why you're advising not. Repeat which it is and why you wouldn't want to get that.
Because their headset is their mixed reality headset is an extremely fascinating device. But as is with virtually all mixed reality devices that I've seen, they are something you wear it on the head, close off the entire outside world for the most part, although Apple's doing some neat things with it. They're very limited in terms of their operating time, the power that they use, what you can do with them. And it's until you can, I think eventually we will get to a point where you can put on a pair of glasses that look like Drew's and they will have the computer in them. Until we get to that point, though, I think mixed reality is very much a niche market and really good for like certain kinds of industrial and commercial uses, but not something, and maybe gaming, but not something that the average person is going to use and put their headset on at the beginning of the day and then come out at the end of the workday. I see really fairly limited appeal to it, but at the roughly $3,500 that Apple was initially going to be selling these first generation ones for, they don't have to sell that many to make money. So it's a niche market. So question from Drew there. When purchasing an M1 or M2, so now you get into some of the things like Windows. Traditionally, when Apple was making Intel processors or based machines, there were two methods ways you could go to do virtualization. One was to actually use something provided by Apple called Boot Camp and reboot your computer into Windows, at which point it's an ordinary everyday Windows computer that just happens to have really pretty engineering. The other way of doing it was to run virtualization software like VirtualBox, like Parallels, like VMware, and that would run a traditional Intel virtual machine on your Intel system. Well, there are limitations in the move to Apple Silicon. Apple Silicon can run into applications that were run for Intel. It has a translation layer built in, and it works extremely well. Speed is excellent. Memory consumption is a little higher when you are using an app that's been translated, but it works, and it works remarkably well. The native apps, of course, always perform better, but that's just kind of how the game is played. Since that time, or since the transition began, there's now a couple of limitations on what you can do. One is that direct kernel drivers that were written for Intel will not work because they exist below the translation layer, and therefore you can't do anything with them. So there are kernel drivers today that are written used for Apple Silicon. They work fine. They require some tweaks to get them to work in the first place, because by default, Apple security does not allow you to run kernel extensions, period. You have to disable that level of security, which you can do pretty easily in order to allow them to function. A lot of older VPN clients use kernel extensions, so that's something that had to transition for a lot of players and ultimately has done so. Besides that, there is something you can do, though, to run Windows on one of these newfangled Macs, which is you can use a virtualization environment. I believe there's a version of VirtualBox at this point that is native to the Apple Silicon processors and can run a selection of ARM operating systems. But the most common way to do it is through one of the commercial virtualizers. The only one that was ready pretty much from the start was Parallels, which is nowadays owned by Turiel. And Parallels is, in fact, even officially supported by Microsoft as the preferred solution for running Windows on a Mac. And it does not run Windows 11 or 10 for Intel, however. It runs Windows for ARM, which is the direction that Microsoft themselves are trying to push into. So I won't go too much into those particular politics, but what I can tell you is that Windows for ARM virtualizes just fine on a Mac, runs at pretty ridiculous speed compared to a version of Windows for Intel, and it can run Intel binaries. So if you have a version of Office or QuickBooks or whatever have you that was written for Intel processors, it will work absolutely fine on Windows for ARM running in virtualization on a Mac. I know because I do that. Because I don't like to carry two computers in my bag, so I've always been a big virtualization person, with the machine doing the virtualization being this Mac that I'm talking to you with right now. So that is very much real. It works. It's an effective solution, and it is updated regularly for improvements to the architecture and all the like. But right now, just for instance, Parallels has partial support for DirectX 12, full support for DirectX 11, and support for everything that Windows for ARM supports itself. So, and that's the solution that I've been using. And VMware just put into public beta their version of their virtualization platform for ARM doing the same with the same capabilities. So they're just not quite as far ahead. So overall, the transition at this point in architectures is complete, and Apple is now on using the same processor family across all of their product line, everything from watches to home speakers to their TV set-top box, to iPads, to iPhones, to Macs. They're all based on one family of architecture, which helps them in doing things with their software and keeping pretty much a similar code base. All the devices they have are running software derived from OS X. So they built one operating system and they bifurcated it in many ways, but your Apple Watch is running OS X. Your Apple TV set-top box is running OS X. Your iPad is running it. Your Mac is running it. Your phone is running it. Your HomePod smart speaker is running a small, compact version of OS X on it, and that does allow for a pretty deep level of integration ultimately. So, that's the, in that half hour or so, that's pretty much the high-end view of what the family looks like, what they've been doing, and what the trend is. You'll see, as I mentioned, you'll see new iPhones released in just under 2 months. That will be the foundation of the next wave of Apple products. You'll see the M2 is the current family. You'll probably see the first M3 devices with whatever improvements are made at that point in the fall of this year, and with that family expanded until they complete it. And so you're looking at what is most likely going to be pretty much an annual release cycle for new processors and products based on them. So anybody want to toss in questions from all that? Or did I just barrage you all?
Yeah, I have a question. Does Apple do its own chip engineering?
Yes. They do all their own design. So Apple, many years ago, they were one of the early investors in and owned, at one point, I think, a majority stake in ARM. And they ultimately sold it off. But one of the things they got and for a large profit, but one of the things that they negotiated with ARM was a perpetual license to their chip architecture. So ARM designs the basic processor core of what an individual processor core looks like, but Apple then uses that as they see fit. They can extend it, they can add functionality to it, they can strip down versions of it, they can re-engineer it any way they want, and they have a lot of chip design expertise that they brought in over the last decade or so, and that is how they've been able to design the Apple Silicon series in general. The first couple of generations of iPhones, they've always been using ARM designs from day one, but when they started, they weren't using Apple designed and manufactured chips. They were using ARM-based processors from Samsung and other vendors. Before, I think the first time they did an Apple designed processor was the iPhone 4. Might have been the iPhone 5, but it doesn't really matter that much. But they started doing their own processor designs with the approximately the iPhone 4 and the first iPad. And since then, they've been designing it themselves and having manufacturing partners do it for them. For roughly the last 10 years or so, TMSC out of Taiwan has been the exclusive manufacturer of their designs. So they had some process expertise, but the design is all Apple. So Ted, you had a
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a single point of failure there potentially, which is Taiwan Semiconductor.
of course.
Because right now, if I was Apple, I would be finding somebody else that you could count on, because you may not have TSMC to work with if things go the way they could happen in China and such. That becomes, from a financial standpoint, I would say if I was an investor in Apple, I would be very, very concerned the fact that it's a one-trick pony right now.
Well, if you're an investor in basically any company at this point that uses RISC processors, TMSC is the major manufacturer for everybody. There's only a handful of companies that have their own fabs besides that. Samsung has limited fab capability. They're not as advanced as TMSC. In fact, nobody is as far along as TMSC as in manufacturing. What TMSC is doing is they're expanding their manufacturing to other global points. So if Taiwan disappears, there are other places that are going to be able to do their manufacturing for them.
That's not real, because it takes 5 years to go from a site survey to having a fab that's in production. And
Well,
if
I know
TSMC disappears next year,
yeah, and I
they
can
could be in
tell you
trouble.
that they've been actively building the one that's in the Western United States. And I can't tell you how far along they are, obviously, and I'm not at that point of things, but I didn't come on to go about the global geopolitics of it. Other than that, Apple's chip designs are at this point being manufactured by TMSC. They're sourcing other chips from other vendors for other uses. But as far as actual manufacturing goes, right now, that is a single point of failure for Apple and for all the other vendors that use TMSC, of which the world is filled with them, including Chinese companies who rely on TMSC for their products as well. So I can't predict what, as I like to refer to them just to piss people off over there, I can't refer to what West Taiwan will do next, or if they're going to do something really mind-bogglingly stupid. They're certainly capable of it, but that's at a pay grade well above mine, whatever they decide to do. So I would hope that they are smart enough to not do anything rash and screw that up for the entire world. But if they do, then we're just not going to get shiny new iPhones for a while. It's just, that is what it is, not something we can change.
Well,
But
I mean, with the amount of money that Apple has, they could buy a fab. It just seems like I've always been suspicious of the fact that the media seems to think of Apple as somebody who has really made major improvements in technology, and really they're just basically a marketing company. They've never really pioneered any technology to speak of. The technologies they acquire, just like Microsoft does. Microsoft doesn't pioneer any technology; they just market it. And I think that's a danger there if everybody depends on the iPhone. And that's just a
Ted,
personal.
Are you running Windows, Linux, Mac? What are you running there, Ted?
I run Windows and Linux.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never had a Mac anything.
That's fine. Nobody's asking. Nobody's.
I went from a Commodore 64 to Windows, and that was the transition.
Yeah. And ultimately there is. I will say this: the Apple in general has pioneered some product categories, but mostly what they do. And they do a lot of research. They do a lot of development on their own. They do a lot of the engineering work that needs to be done to make advancements. But Apple is not going to be first in virtually anything. There were smartphones before the iPhone. Does anybody remember your Palm Treo? Remember how much it sucked? Because it did.
But it was the only thing available, and it did what it was supposed to do.
Exactly. My favorite Trio app was always there was an app called World's Most Accurate GPS. And whenever you activated the app, and it would just put a little X on screen and say, "You are here." Perfectly accurate.
Yeah.
So, did Apple pioneer some technologies that are used in the smartphone today? Did they reinvent the concept of what the smartphone could be? Absolutely. They made it a single pane, a single sheet of glass, as opposed to as the screens, the early generation smartphones that had physical keyboards, had small screens, didn't have anything like gesture sensitivity. So was that an Apple innovation? Absolutely it was. Would it probably have hit the market somehow anyway? Yeah, probably somebody would have come up with that if they didn't. Did it take other products that were under development and by other companies, like what Android was originally going to be, and completely make them start over? Yes, it did. So what Apple does is not so much to invent a technology, is they see where things are going. They look at what needs to happen, what they think needs to happen to make that popular, and then they do it. And they execute it, and they do design to make it work. They manufacture it at scale, and they sell the crap out of it.
And they make it very easy for the non-technical consumer to use it. I mean, I'm a Windows guy, but I'm a very technical person. But the way they make iPhones and the Macs work seamlessly together, it's one environment across all their products, and that's what I think is their secret.
Yeah, and they put all that work into integration between all the various products, and they make their entire ecosystem work well together, play well together, and make you want to use it and make you want to stay in it. And that's, it's a design that works both ways. They have certain design ethos that they use. They have a product usability ethos they designed. They have a privacy ethos that they care about. And they also have a model that is very different from what we're used to seeing on the internet with vendors like Google and vendors like to a lesser extent Microsoft, because they have a more traditional profit model, or the Facebooks of the world and all the like, which is they sell privacy as a product to a degree that traditional vendors who give you either a free or really inexpensive service where you're the product. Apple's ethos has been to let you retain maximum control over your own data and just not share it with people by default. And on top of that, they charge you for it. So, Apple's very clearly in it for the cash, but at the same time, not by being in it for the cash, they're not making their cash from selling you to other people. And I think that is, people do respond positively to that. It's when you go on and check some friend's status update on Facebook, it's very nice. It's a nice convenience. It's nice to be able to stay in touch with people, but ultimately you're the product being sold. And with Google, as useful as all their services are, you are ultimately the product that they're selling to advertisers, because that's their model. And I said, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just a user should understand where the money is coming from. And with Apple, it's coming from you and being vacuumed into their pockets. But in exchange for that, some people will sleep a little better at night knowing knowing how Apple's treating you. So that's the philosophical side of it, I guess. But ultimately, what they are trying to do is create a suite of products where they control the technology behind it. They make them all work nicely enough together so that you're going to want to retain using with their products. It's an effective model that generally seems to work. Anybody else want to ask anything, or send me off on a diatribe?
I have a question about why Apple chose to use a traditional file system on the Mac, but when they came out with the iPhone and the iPad, iOS doesn't have a like a slash anything in it, does it?
Well, they do. They do have a file system, and in fact, underneath the hood, it's the same file system. It's called APFS, which is the successor to the file system that they used for about 25 years called HFS Plus. But APFS is what is behind the hood of every Apple operating system. It's behind, my watch is storing its data in APFS. So the reason why the difference is in the iPhone and in the iPad, you have limited ability to access that file system as a user. They keep access to that locked down. They're letting things only, there is no path to install user applications. Everything is distributed through the App Store or through a few limited other means, and they don't give you direct access to it. And part of the biggest reason for that, in Apple's opinion, is been a security standpoint. They don't want apps to have direct access to all but limited parts of the file system. They don't want apps to have access to each other than through a few rigidly defined channels. And that's the main issue there is people using a computer are used to fiddling. They fiddle with stuff, they tinker with stuff, they install their own applications, they use it as they see fit. And there's a lot of paths by which you can go dig in, find out something, bring up a command line if you need to, because it's all Unix under the hood. People don't generally want to do that with their phone. I'm as technical a user as it gets. I want my phone to just be a phone and work. I don't want to install an app and have it ruin another app that I have on there. I don't want to worry about things like driver conflicts. I don't want to worry about something overwriting something else on the file system and screwing it up. And so Apple, when they did the iPhone initially, and they first came up with iPhone apps, they set what those bounds were. And again, it's a case where the users overwhelmingly have wanted it just that way. Even if on an Android phone, for an Android user, typically speaking, most Android phones have the ability to install apps from other sources, but it's not super easy, convenient, and most people don't do it. And most people don't want to dig into the file system of their Android phone. They just want to go in, download an app, use the app. So we do, but there is, for a full user space on the iPhone, there is a full downloads folder. That is shared by multiple apps. There's a documents folder. All those things that normally live in user space do in fact live on the iPhone and on the iPad, and you have access to them.
Okay, because there's one software program that I use on Android, Windows, and Linux that has been unsuccessful at deploying on the iOS devices, which is it's called SyncThing. It's a peer-to-peer synchronization program, and you could take your downloads folder or your pictures folder on an Android and synchronize it to your Windows or Linux machine or your Mac. They support Mac OS X or OS, just not the iOS, because they can't get it to recognize the file system.
Well, they can access those parts of the file system. They can access the downloads and documents folder, but as far as the rest of that goes, on Mac, on iOS, there are a bunch of mechanisms under the hood already to handle synchronization with a Mac and with other devices. In the case of what they're doing on the, in the Apple ecosystem, is they're using iCloud Drive to do that. And it keeps within iCloud Drive, that automatically keeps, and I use that myself, I keep my photos all in sync as I take them. As I take photos, they're all synchronized, they're all automatically available to all my devices. And I do know how to get to them if I need to on the computer side of things, but it's handled in a database. My documents folder, my downloads folder, my desktop folder, those are all automatically synchronized between all my devices, including my phone and my iPad and my laptop and my desktop. So I have the same contents in those folders on all my devices. But it's handled behind this. It's not handled by a sync app, it's handled by the OS.
Right. This is an open source cross-platform app that just wants to grab a folder and send it to another device, and it can't, I don't think.
Yeah, theoretically, what you could do if you really wanted to run something like that on an iOS device is if you had an iOS code branch, you could just compile it and install it locally, and there's nothing stopping you from doing that. So you can build and self-deploy your own apps if you want to, and you could give it the access accordingly. But I don't think you'd get that distributed through the App Store as something. Apple's probably wouldn't take that because it does what they're already building in. So that's likely.
Yeah. The developers tried. They came out with a beta version for Apple iOS, but it never made it into production because they just couldn't get it to work right with their with Linux and Windows and Mac OS.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by that, simply because simply put, Apple is generally pretty flexible about putting things on the App Store. They're pretty conscious of that, but they don't typically allow apps on there that just implement core functionality they already have. Since that synchronization is built in. So why have somebody else's program do it when they already do it?
So you can share with other platforms.
Sure, and there's plenty of sharing. There's sharing available, like you can share files to any platform. I can share files to Windows right from an app that has direct on the Mac, on the iPad, for instance, that has direct file system access. I can even access SMB drives from an iPad nowadays. But as far as sync, there are third-party products that do sync, like for instance, Dropbox and OneDrive all can sync your documents folders between platforms. But it can't sync, obviously it can't sync everything, but it can sync most everything between my different platforms. It's just it's a matter of what is exposed at the user level, what is inherent to the platform, and and really, I'd say it's, without having any inside the App Store knowledge, it's probably just a design decision on their part, for the most part, saying they don't expose functionality that they're already providing, or they don't make it easy for you to implement something that they're already doing. Why have an app why would they? Also, why would a developer want to write an app or want to sell an app on the store to do something that's already being done?
Yeah, this is a non-cloud based product. It's designed for people that don't want to use a cloud server. So it's a different concept than what Apple has deployed for its product line. My last question is, if you are on Linux, is there a way to easily access your iCloud drive other than through a browser?
Not that I am aware of at this point. It's theoretically, there's no reason why somebody couldn't write a back end using web tech and JavaScript to do all that. I don't think it's been done. But remember, Apple's beneath everything, Apple's basically just running BSD with their own kernel. So
That's a Linux or Unix distribution.
Yeah. Yeah, they're just running underneath the hood. It's BSD with a kernel that was developed a long time ago as a research product. It was called Mock, and everything is based on that. So there's no technical reason why you couldn't implement an iCloud-like interface. Apple allows it through the web. Apple has already produced iCloud for Windows with full support. So it could be done I don't think anybody's done it, but it could be done.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Yeah, change topics if you don't mind. My understanding is that people in the video, TV, movie industry, or even the people who, dabble in that, use MacBooks to a great extent in comparison to other products. Is that true? And if it is, why is it that Apple has kind of cornered that market and seemed to hang on to that market?
Well, Apple is pretty much the leader on the video production side. It's not that Windows is uncommon, but Apple has a very strong presence in that market. Part of that is, I would say, because Apple originally had one of the first strong real-time editing products with Final Cut Pro,
right?
Which they had, I forget who they bought it from, but they turned it into a product under their own brand and sold it at a much cheaper price than most other editors. That gave Apple a very, very strong presence in the video editing market. Since then, they have retained that lead for the most part, but not to the extent that they once had. But the other video editing products, Premiere and Avid, are on the Mac platform as well. And unless, given differences in what you're working in, what your particular production goal is, and all the like, Apple, for the most part, and especially now with their new processor architecture, has had a pretty strong technical lead for most people. You can buy a Apple system that'll render your video streams and let you do your real-time editing for typically, although almost surprisingly, typically for a lower price than most Windows-based systems are going to need, nor do the same thing, because on the Windows side, to get the equivalent performance, you've got to put a lot of money into GPUs.
Hasn't Apple also been much more popular with creative people in general?
Traditionally.
Yeah.
I mean, traditionally, typically though, and this, I'm not going to be not to be like an Apple stan on this one, but typically speaking, all the good creative software, most major applications in just about all areas are multi-platform nowadays. You can get the same software on Windows and on Mac. They're building the same code base for both platforms. And that's been the case for a number of years. That should continue to be the case. The reason Apple has a big developer-focused conference every year where they introduce all their new technologies, and they're doing that to try and encourage software to be built on their platform and to take advantage of the technologies that they're providing. And that's kind of like business success 101, right? So there's there's some self-fulfilling prophecy. For Apple has been a leader in video production, in sound editing, in creative use, in publishing and design for a long, long time. So people continue to buy Macs to do that job since everybody else is using them. There's always people using alternate platforms in something. There's people using Windows to do this, but most people are using Macs. And just to give you, before I take Steve's just one other interesting bit of what I would refer to as anecdata. My son will be a college senior this fall, and he is he's a finance major. And finance has traditionally been a lot of people sitting in classrooms using Dells and running Excel on them. He's in a college of roughly 4,500 people. His business school there's about 600 or 700 people in the business school majors that he's in. He doesn't know a single person using Windows. Everybody over there is started out by owning an iPhone in high school and uses a Mac in college. They're running Excel, which is just the same software that everybody uses to do finance work, but they're running it on their Macs.
That's because Apple got into the education arena before anybody else did.
They got into the education arena. They got into the education arena decades ago and had a good start on it. But in my son's high school, they were using Chromebooks. And he chose to use his old MacBook Pro because it had a bigger screen and the battery life was better. And he just logged into Chrome and did his stuff from within there instead of using his Chromebook. But when he got to college, for a long time, college in all majors was pretty much people using Windows. And that was what people used when they had to pay their own money in college for a laptop and they needed a laptop. But over the last 10 years or so, pretty much everybody within my son's peer group at his age is an iPhone user. So when the time came for them to get a laptop to go to college, they went out and got a Mac. And then they just made it all work. And so there's a whole generation of kids coming out of college right now who are doing things, who are going to go into offices and not be very happy if somebody gives them a PC to work with. So we'll see how that little bit of political conflict plays out. Generally speaking, Apple, and I work plenty on Windows. I have Windows running on this machine that I'm talking to you on as a VM. I have a Windows computer sitting right next to it on my desk. But generally speaking, if I open up Windows, it's because I need to do something in Windows. If I just want to turn on the computer, not worry about things working and get stuff done, I'm typically going to be doing it on a Mac. And that's been the case for me for work, for pleasure, for whatever, for 20 plus years, or that I've been Mac primary. So, that's pretty much, if there's anything else that you guys want to, ping around for a few minutes, we can. Otherwise, hopefully that gets everybody up to today.
Is there a point now where the marginal utility of these functions, like like the glasses that people wear that I've tried, I thought were very unimpressive. Is there a point where although the technology is fabulous, the marginal utility is minimal? It just doesn't advance what the ordinary user would want to use the computer for. Are we anywhere near that?
I mean, I think you can argue that we've basically been at that point for the most part for years. I think it's a legitimate argument you can make. We've had years and years of relatively diminishing annual return, so to speak. The difference is, and this there's a lot of ways you can discuss and or debate this. Devices are built they're built using technology that gives them, for better or for worse, a finite lifespan that is maybe a few years off in the future. But I give my clients and friends generally this kind of rule of thumb. You buy a smartphone, you don't need to buy a new smartphone every year. They would love you to buy a new smartphone every year, but unless you find something that is absolutely, I gotta have it, you should be buying a smartphone at most every two to maybe more likely 3 years. Why? Because over time, the battery wears out and it gets to be a pain in the butt to deal with. The screen may start having issues. The machine just has been battered around by being in your pocket for a long time, and things happen to them. And after a few years, that reliability of it is going to drop down. If your entire life is run by your smartphone, you should get a new one every few years. An iPad, I generally use it for 4 to 5 years before I get another one. A laptop, because I put it in my bag, and every day that I go to clients, it's being schlepped around in my bag and plugged in and unplugged and all that and all the like. I tell most folks that 3 to 4 years out of a laptop is pretty good if you're using it for work and you're relying on it as your everyday life. Desktop computers should be more. It should be able to go longer. Apple does a new operating system every year. They generally support machines going back for anywhere from 5 to 8 years, depending on the model, depending on the generation and all the like. And they will typically do security updates beyond that for a couple of years on top of it.
But you're talking about functionality, which I do understand.
Functionality,
but I'm talking about marginal utility. That is, does the machine offer
marginal
anything?
Utility is up to you.
Well, at some point, you got everything you want, and that's it.
Yeah. I'll say this: if everybody got only everything they wanted, instead of the Model T, people wanted faster horses.
Right.
People wanted faster horses. They didn't want the Model T. Then the Model T came out and people were like, oh, I want this. So marginal utility is a personal decision, basically. If it seems like something that will benefit you, then you want it. If it doesn't benefit you, don't buy it.
That's why the marketing is such a big part of those companies, because the actual technological innovation is marginal. You could pretty much take a Dodge or a Chevy pickup truck or something from the 50s, and it's probably as good from the marginal utility function if all you want to do is haul crap in the back of the pickup truck. Now, if you want to have screens in the front and you want to have navigation and phones and all that, of course, that's different. You want a much more recent version. But I think you made a good point about the lifetimes of these things. My general rule of thumb always was processor speed. If it's 10x, then it's time to take the other thing and make it into a boat anchor. If it's only 2 or 3x, it's marginal.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'd like to switch back to
one improvement, though.
Drew has his hand up.
Yep. I'll just leave it on the last thing before we get to that is, if processor speed, camera capability, storage, other processor enhancements, things like on-chip AI capabilities and things like neural links on the chip itself. Year to year, there's not much difference. Every 2 to 3 years, there's enough of a difference that it's worth considering. So, and if it's not worth it for you, then don't do it.
Yeah.
Drew?
My question is, I know that a Mac can access an SMB share on like a Windows computer. Can it also share files so that a Windows computer can attach to a share or Linux computer?
Yeah, it can do SMB sharing, and just that's all built in.
So it can be both a server and a client.
Yeah, my wife runs a PC. I run a Mac, and I share files back and forth with her all the time. She's running Windows 7, and we're a very happy couple.
Yeah, the Mac used to be so the Mac has support for SMB read-only, or read-only SMB file systems natively, and then can be extended to have read-write capabilities with software. I use one from some company called Paragon to do read-write NTFS. They have SMB sharing. They've had that for 15 years or more. And now it's the standard. But it used to be that they had their own network file system called AFP, sorry. That was their native protocol. They still support it, but their native protocol now is SMB.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for spending some
Thank
time
you.
with us today.